multitude of different outputs. It could be anything from a blog to a website to a book or a magazine or a photographic study or an exhibition, or it could be an app, could be any number of things. The outputs are up to them, so it is by default a little bit cross-disciplinary, or they have the opportunity to be cross-disciplinary within it, to tell stories, to change storylines, to impact their lives. But they'll also be working with artisans in the developing world for one of their other projects, so helping them with systems that supports them in the continuation of their material culture, that helps them gain financial success within their chosen craft. And so there's a number of ways that they will work, hopefully, to affect change.
Mm-hmm. So that's really cultural change from what we've had, in recent decades, isn't it, within fashion?
Yeah, I think culture is actually a really important word in this conversation because, we're in a culture of consumerism and of consumption. And so to shift that to something where fashion has a positive instead of a negative impact. I mean, at this stage, so many people are aware of the negative impacts of the fashion industry, whether it's waste or pollution or people in the supply chain, all of those different issues. So I think that it's important to have these discussions about sustainable impact on those things.
So how do you feel about these big fashion businesses thriving almost in the current environment? Like, how can we change that?
That's back to that world culture in a way, isn't it? Because I think we need a culture shift in terms of what we consider values. What are our values? Since almost post-war, we've been in a culture in the West where consumerism and how much stuff you own and the value of that stuff and whether that stuff is the latest model or whatever it is, or the highest fashion or the most luxurious brand, is how we define our value and how we define our own success. And that's a huge problem that we have to address. And so I think we are looking at a culture shift in terms of how we define value and how we define success, what that actually means, and that does require a culture shift.
Mm-hmm. How's the pandemic influenced that?
I think the pandemic's given a lot of people a moment to realise that a lot of things that we thought weren't possible actually were. Simple things like working from home. 99% of brands or companies would have said, no, that's not an option. But of course it was an option in the pandemic. We didn't have a choice. But it's also given everyone a minute to sort of take a step back from life as usual to see what is possible. So I think a lot of the pandemic has impacted the possibility for change. The reality of that is still to be realised, but I think it's given a lot of people time to think about, their own values. It was a big value shift for a lot of people.
Mm. So Sass, your books really influenced my own journey in this space. So I'm just wondering, when you reflect back on how things have changed in the last decade or 15 years or however long you feel you've been stepping out in the sustainability space, how's that going, and what change have you noticed?
Oh, so much has changed in many ways, and other things have not changed at all. Obviously there's a much wider understanding of the impact of the fashion industry and of the consumption of it and the waste in it and all of the processes that our textiles and garments go through and the people that produce them. It's a much wider acknowledgement of the impacts that fashion has on people and planet. So that has changed. There's a much more understood link between climate change and the fashion industry, which is another good thing. However, consumption has continued to increase, wastage has continued to increase, the market share of synthetic materials and the chemicals that go into producing them has continued to increase. So things have certainly changed in terms of awareness, not necessarily in terms of impact. I mean, if we look at some of the brands that have developed in the last few years, such as Shein, I mean, you're talking about a brand that's taken the original model of fast fashion that Zara built back in the 90s and put it on crack effectively, you know, so that there are potentially thousands of new styles being produced each week, not just each quarter or whatever. So, I mean, the speed of fast fashion has gone up, the price has continued to be reduced, so it is a consumable, it's disposable by default. The quality, of course, has gone down. It has to be when you're reducing prices to that scale. So there are a lot of problems we need to resolve, a great many. So a lot of things have changed for the better, and a lot of things have not changed for the better. There isn't a brand that isn't aware they have to do more and do better, and there is much more transparency and accountability, not nearly enough yet, and there's a lot of greenwashing within that. One of the big problems that I see is many people are looking for binary solutions. They're looking for a yes or no, this is good or bad, and I get that all the time when I speak online or do panels or talk to my students. You know, is this good? It's just not that simple. This is a very complicated, multi-layered problem that we have with fashion and the interconnected processes that textiles and garments go through. So there is no nirvana, there's no perfect solution. There are lots of ways of doing better and doing more, but we also have to be really clear and transparent about the downside of that. You know, the example I often give when I'm talking about this sort of thing is the difference between a designer who perhaps is working locally in a local community, using locally sourced goods, using locally sourced labour, and selling to the local community, therefore building the community that they work within. Obviously a really valuable undertaking, and with a much reduced carbon footprint. Compare that to a designer that's, say, working with an indigenous community in any number of different developing countries around the world that has a material heritage that is in serious danger of being lost because there's no commercial applications for their work, or because they've been culturally appropriated for decades, or any number of other issues. And a designer that's working to maintain that heritage, to give those artisans a voice, to support them in the continuation of that tradition, to make it financially prosperous for them to continue, and to respect and care about their work. Now, inevitably, if you're a designer in the UK or wherever else and you're importing from, you know, another nation, you know, in the developing world, you're going to have a way higher carbon footprint to that product. Is one solution any better than the other? No, they're absolutely not. You can only filter that through your own values, because we can't do everything and be everything. You can't produce locally, sustain material heritage around the world, have no carbon footprint, you know, not use water in your production, not waste at the end. You've got to choose where your values lie. And so I think that there are an incredible range of interventions happening around the world, but what's really important is understanding our own value system and making a hierarchy of what we can impact within our own space, whether as a designer, a producer, a practitioner, or a brand, or a consumer.
So on the consumer thing, really, like, brands aren't going to change. The fact that Shein has cut through overwhelming production now, the brands are not going to change, it would think. So does that mean the consumer, the wearer of clothes, is more responsible?
I'm really
where does
wary of that. I think that, you know, it puts an awful lot of responsibility on the consumer, and I'm not saying that the consumer doesn't have to take responsibility. I think we all do. But I think to make real sustainable change, there are three key components to that change. One has to be the consumer, another one has to be the brands themselves, and the third has to be government legislation. Because the brands aren't going to change unless their customers demand differently, unless the government requires them to do differently, because their motivation is profit. So I think it takes all of those stakeholders to make significant change. And that doesn't mean that individuals don't have a responsibility. They're a third of that model, of that dynamic. So we do all each have a responsibility. I think one of the positive things that has changed is that we no longer have as much a separation as we used to between work and personal values. You know, it used to be that, well, that's work, that's not personal. And I think many more people are taking their personal values into the workplace. And that includes, you know, looking at waste or looking at consumption and looking at all of those different impacts.
What sort of legislation would be useful? Like what's happening where?
Gosh, there are some really interesting things. I mean, Mexican government just came out with their Intellectual Property Act to support indigenous communities with their material culture. It has a few challenges as it's being put to the test for the first time, but it's the first country that is actually developing this. There are a lot of other initiatives around the world, of course, but that's a really positive step to protect indigenous material cultural heritage. A country like Mexico, of course, is particularly rich in that. Also a country that's particularly culturally appropriated by high street fashion brands, and luxury brands come to that, you know. So that's a really positive thing. Certainly there's government legislation to do with anti-slavery acts, to do with minimum pay, to do with things like that that are obviously hugely important. I think that there's a lot more to be done in the US. Right now there's a new bill that's being considered which is about sustainability, a number of sustainability factors within the fashion industry. The UK government have been looking at it for a few years now. In fact, it was the government that actually did a formal inquiry into Pretty Little Things here in the UK because of their underpaying of their labour in the middle of the UK, in Leicester. So we're not talking about a developing country here. So I think the government and legislation has a huge role to play in this. And there are good things happening, but there's a lot more to be done.
Thank you for that, Sass. That's kind of the industry part dealt with. And now maybe if we can just talk about your personal approach to your own wardrobe. So can you just talk about your pathway into creativity?
Gosh, how far do I go back with this? I mean, I've always been a creator. As long as I can remember, I wanted to be a designer. I was a designer in the industry for many years. Before I went into academia and writing and sharing information, knowledge transfer with creative communities, whether in the academic space, etc. So I've always had a love of textiles and materials and design and beauty. Reason many of us get into fashion, but like many, I also got a bit disheartened by the reality of working within the industry as a commercial designer. So in terms of now, and a lot of my work, creative work, is actually writing, whether it's writing new programs, whether it's teaching, whether it's developing a new website and sharing stories, whether it's advising companies and brands. There's a lot of ways that my creativity is utilised, so a lot of it goes in that way now, rather than hands-on. That said, I do a number of crafts myself, just as to reduce the stress of daily life, to be honest, to decompress.
So you are hands-on in that way. Do you want to tell us a bit about how that is expressed?
Sure. I took a couple of years off to do my PhD, so I was effectively a student at the ripe old age of 60, and lived pretty much like a student for those couple of years while I finished off. So I was on an absolute very small budget to live, and I was actually buying sweaters from the thrift shop and unraveling them to knit new things for myself. It's a habit I still continue, even though I don't quite have to anymore. I always patch and mend. I have a love for visible mending, so I'm always patching and mending my own clothes. For a long time, I've bought pieces that I love and I want to hold on to. I mean, there are garments in my wardrobe that I've had for 20, 25 years, some possibly even longer than that, but certainly not throwaway clothing, pieces that I want to hold on to, I want to keep, I want to love, I want to wear, and I want to repair when they need repairing. And sometimes they become better when I've repaired them, you know, with the patching or the sewing or whatever it is that's on there. So I definitely only now invest in clothing that I want, and I want to keep.
What's your motivation for that, do you think? Have you analysed it?
Good question. I think that I certainly found over the years, like many people, I've purchased things on a whim that I never wore. I've purchased things for particular whether events or something, like work clothing that, you know, weren't necessarily something, there were things I chose, but they were still to fit in with a certain environment or a certain expectation, and I don't do that anymore. I am who I am, I dress how I dress, and if you don't accept it, then that's your problem, not mine. So I've certainly done that in the past. So my motivation has been that this is just an incredible waste of money. From my personal perspective, it's a waste of money, but it's also a waste of the energy that went into making it, whether it's the carbon footprint or whether it's the logistics or whether it's the packaging it was wound up in or whether it's the labour that went into it. And it just seemed like an incredible waste, and that I know that I have things that I still love now, even maybe more than when I originally bought them. So having the luck, the advantage of being able to travel widely, I've often purchased things in the countries that I've been visiting that I just couldn't possibly get anywhere else, and particularly artisanal work that is local to that environment. And those things are the things that I really love, probably more than anything.
And what about the well-being benefits that come from this attachment and caring for things in your wardrobe?
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly a sense of accomplishment in keeping things that I've loved, that have, you know, now got a hole or worn thin or whatever, and finding creative means of maintaining them. But there's definitely an emotional, there's almost a meditative process, value, I think, to crafting and to mending and to taking care of things. Certainly there's a sense of accomplishment, but I find I need things like knitting and sewing just to decompress after my day, especially now working so much in an intellectual or something that pulls on my brain power a lot, you know, that whether it's writing or speaking or teaching or advising, all of those things are a huge mental drain. And I can get home from just teaching a class and have nothing left, mentally, emotionally, nothing. I'm just a shell. And the only thing I'm capable of is sewing and knitting something, and it's something that allows me to decompress and to change, to shift my mental status. So it's really important to me.
So that really sounds like a mental health benefit as well as just feeling good.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about how that might work, like how the physicality of it?
Ooh, I think that crafting in general, I mean, obviously there are exceptions to this. I mean, I knit a lot, and so, you know, a completely complicated pattern can be a bit taxing too. But something that's more repetitive, I think, such as simpler knitting patterns or cross stitch or whatever it is, mending, those sort of things that don't take an enormous amount of brain power. They can take creative input, but not intellectual analysis, for example. I think they have a meditative quality, and I think meditation has been proven to have all sorts of health and mental health and well-being, emotional stability benefits that come out of it. I mean, there's, you know, lots of brands that work with crafting, whether it's women, you know, survivors of violence, whether it's refugee communities, whether it's prisoners that have, you know, documented year upon year the benefits of learning some of these techniques and taking care of things and producing something. So I think they have absolutely well documented benefits from a mental health perspective, especially post-pandemic. I mean, we're not really post-pandemic, are we? But you know, I mean, people being stuck inside for so long, stores being closed, all of those things, I think, you know, and needing creative outlets and outlets to do things that were different than their normal life. I think craft has given an awful lot of people an opportunity to recover to a degree.
And I guess in addition to those health benefits, there's also the environmental health benefits and perhaps the potential to have less textile waste when we're more hands-on and we're keeping things we love.
Absolutely. I mean, waste is one of the big issues in fashion, isn't it? In mainstream is that disposability, that discarding, and there's no real good output from the end of life of a garment. Most of it either goes into landfill or is incinerated. Of course, there's reclamation of fibre, there's upcycling, there's recycled clothing, but a lot of that is hands-on and individual, and so there is obviously a huge benefit. I think it's one of many different interventions that needs to be utilised a great deal more on an individual level, but also on a brand level. I mean, the amount of textile waste, garment waste, unsold stock, quality control, failures that brands and companies and designers are left with, for that to end up in landfill or be incinerated is just an incredible waste of materials, of energy, of carbon footprint, of, you know, all of the different things that go into produce it. There are much better ways of using our waste, and I think changing our mindset from considering it waste to actually resource, I think, is a big part of that.
And that is happening a bit, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Can you tell us, give a few examples of that?
Oh, there's lovely examples. I mean, my second book was just on designers working with upcycled materials, because there were so many that I found out about and I knew about that I couldn't fit them into a chapter in the first book. So
that was Refashioned, was your second one, was
that's
it?
That's right, yes. So there is so much amazing stuff happening. You know, some of my favourite examples, and have been examples for favourites to me for a long time, are people like Christine Meyer, now called Into the Light, used to be called Meyer Peace Collection, who works with vintage materials, domestic materials. So things like napkins and, you know, so on, mattress ticking, things like that. She also works with flour sacks, flour as in the flour that you make bread from, vintage flour sacks, and does an absolutely exquisite collection. And I think, to me, she's one of the people that really had a poetic response to translating waste into value. And taking those, because she works with vintage materials, we're talking about materials that are often stained and hauled and repaired, and taking those marks that most people think devalue a material as actually valuing them more by telling their story of their past life before they became a jacket or a skirt or whatever they became. And so taking what many people see as a problem and actually making it something hugely valuable. And so I love her work because I think it's a really poetic response of changing that shift, you know, from waste to resource and storytelling, which is super important. So she's one really good example. Steinweider's one I often quote as well, Austrian brand, and I often use them as an example because they just use such an unexpected source of waste. Too often designers go to a default of leftover material on the roll, dead stock fabric, when they're thinking about recycling, but there's so many more creative means of finding a waste resource, because everything we produce has a waste stream, right? So Steinweider work with socks, and it's such an unexpected material to upcycle into garments. But sock producers have the same amount of waste as garment producers and textile producers, with their cancelled orders, their tests, their samples, their quality control failures, all of those things. So they make a whole collection out of socks, and I just think it's an inspired use of materials. So let me see, who else have I got in terms of favourites out there?
Maybe your jacket, you could tell us about that, Sass. Just hold that up and we'll have a look at.
Yeah, gosh, I've had this for about, I don't even know how long. This is when I lived in Florence. How long ago is that? God, it's got to be 15, 20 years or something. So I bought this from a little boutique that no longer exists, I don't think, in Milan. So obviously Milan's not that far away from Florence, so I used to go there quite often, and I have continued to patch it, which works just fine with the style. So, and the whole thing is just all patchwork, and I love it. It's such a great piece. I mean, even as my body has changed over the years, I've inserted panels. So, but from a design perspective, it's an easy thing to do with something like that. So, yeah. That was a good find, and something else that I've loved and worn a very lot.
So this having some skills to be able to do that is useful, isn't it? Absolutely. Skills, time, and motivation are the other things, aren't they? Yeah. Where do you think people are at with that?
I think, with the digital space, there are a million how-tos and bloggers and vloggers that show you how to do things. I think one of the really cool things that I've loved in the last few years is the development of community-based workshops, whether they're in cafes or bars or wherever they are, that teach a skill, whether it's how to repair your computer or your coffee machine, or sew a button on or alter your clothes and put a hem up. And a lot of those community spaces have developed over the last few years, where you can just go for free, and it becomes a social space as well. So it's a place to meet people, it's a place to have a conversation, it's a place to get you out of working from home all day, every day, and it's an opportunity to learn a skill and to be inspired by other people. Like, I often go to knit-ins. I was one a few weeks ago where, no cost, just a bunch of people get together and knit. So, and there's usually someone there who can teach you if you don't know how to do it, and some spare yarn and some spare needles. So, but broadening that out into mending, visible mending, into repair, into altering, I think has been one of the really great examples that's happened. There's not nearly enough of that yet, but many cities do have one space where that happens.